the president. I'm on the wrong window. All right, let's start that over again. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program from the Jewish Genealogy Society of Pittsburgh. For those of you who are unaware, my name is Steve Jaron, and I'm the president of the organization. We are excited to introduce our speaker, Laura Liebman, but first, some housekeeping items. Please be aware that this program is being recorded, and please also ensure that your microphones are muted. Our next program will be on March 27th at 1 p.m. with Mona Friedman Morris, entitled Getting Ready for the 1950 Census. On April 24th at 11 a.m., the next installment of our series on Jewish names will be presented by Kristen Fermaglish, where she'll be discussing the various reasons Jews would change their names. All regular programming is $5 for the general public and is free for members of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Pittsburgh. For just $18 a year, you can be a member of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Pittsburgh. Along with free access to all programming, you'll have access to our growing members portal, which currently includes recordings of past speakers and back issues of our newsletter. You will also have a subscription to our newsletter and have access to our private Facebook group. To join, please visit our website, www.pghjgs.org. I will put the address in the chat as well. Please also consider following us on our social media. Aside from membership dues, donations help offset the costs associated with our various activities, such as having the level of programming we've been able to offer over the past year and a half. If you so choose, you can donate to our organization via our Square site. I'll also put the URL in the chat. This program was made possible through generous support from the William M. Lowenstein Genealogical Research Endowment Fund at the Jewish Community Foundation. Laura Arnold Liebman is a professor of English and Humanities at Reed College, VP of Publications, AJS, and the author of The Art of the Jewish Family, A History of Women in Early New York in 5 Objects, Bard Graduate Center 2020, which won 3 National Jewish Book Awards. She held visiting positions at Bard Graduate Center, Oxford University, University of Utrecht, University of Panama, and University of Panama. Her latest book, Once We Were Slaves, Oxford UP 2021, is about an early multiracial Jewish family who began their lives as slaves in the Caribbean and became some of the wealthiest Jews in New York. And now, without further ado, here's Laura.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share screen. So for some reason you don't start seeing images, definitely let me know, as they will help the presentation.
I see it. I can't speak for everyone else.
Okay, great. I'll assume that's a good sign. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a multiracial Jewish family that began their lives poor, Christian, and enslaved in the Caribbean, but by 30 years later had reached the pinnacle of New York's wealthy Jewish elite. As the family made their way around the Atlantic world before coming to New York, their race changed. That is, while they were born and designated at birth as being people of color, by the time that they died in New York, their race had been reassigned as white. As I'm telling you their story today, I'm hoping that you'll take away at least 3 things. One is just something about their histories and themselves as people. And that's because I think sometimes we think the most interesting people in history are going to be the people who are famous during their own lifetimes. But I hope through the story of Sarah and Isaac to really show you that sometimes people who even their descendants thought were relatively unimportant turn out to be completely fascinating. The second thing that I hope you'll take away from it is something about how race was working in the Atlantic world in this time period between the end of the 18th century and the first part of the 19th century. And in particular, I want to focus in on how race was impacting Jews. So many times this kind of story of people who are racially ambiguous and were able to change their racial assignment over the course of their lives gets told through the stories of passing. Some of you may have even seen the recent movie adaptation of Nell Larson's novel with that same name. But what I want to emphasize for today is that for people like Sarah and Isaac who were Jewish, that sort of story of having one racial assignment and then hiding it from everybody by moving someplace else was just never possible. Every single place that they went to, the Jewish community was so small and so intertwined that they kept on running into people from the Barbadian community that knew of their early life enslaved. So in that sense, Jews really have a different story to tell about race during this time period. The third thing that I'm hoping you'll take away from the presentation, however, is something about the larger history of multiracial Jews that may help some of you who've had interesting things come up in your genealogies or just for thinking about Jews and multiculturalism today. And that is, we often recognize that the Jewish communities today are fairly diverse, ranging somewhere between 9 to up to 25% of people within US Jewish communities having at least one family member or all of the people in their household being identifying as non-white. What I'm hoping you'll take away from this morning's presentation is that history isn't something that just happened, say, after the 1970s, but really is something that we should be thinking about a much longer history of pushing backward in time. So with those three things in mind, something about Sarah and Isaac, something about race, something about the history of multicultural Jews, I want to go ahead and turn to that island where Sarah and Isaac were born in the eastern part of the Caribbean, and that's the island of Barbados. So Sarah and Isaac's journey into Judaism came in large part because their father was a Sephardic Jew. His name was Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, and he was, by the time of his death, the wealthiest Jew on the island. In contrast, however, their mother was a woman named Sarah Esther Gill, or sometimes Sarah Esther Lopez. And like her children, she was born enslaved. So she lived in the Lopez family's household, a Sephardic household, but not as a genealogical member of that family, but rather as somebody who was enslaved to them. And this couple not only had Sarah and Isaac, who lived to adulthood, but at least two other children that passed away during their childhood. Well, Abraham had a number of plantations along the western part of the island. That wasn't where Sarah and Isaac and their mother were born. Instead, they were born in the main port town called Bridgetown on the southern part of the island. And they grew up along a street called Swan Street. And if you somehow could see this very little writing below Swan Street, it says, or Jew Street. And that's because many of the island's Jews lived along this particular street that was very famous as a merchant street. Part of the reason why Jews lived there was it was very closely located next to the Nida Israel Synagogue, the main synagogue on the island of Barbados. And both the children's father and the family that enslaved them, the Lopezes, were members of that particular congregation. In fact, during his life, their father would be not only a member of that congregation, but a member of the governing board, or Mahamad, as well as at times the president of the congregation. So he's really a mainstay of the island community. In contrast, the Lopez family that enslaved the children and their mother was a sort of middle class Jewish family, not particularly wealthy, not particularly successful. And they lived not in a mansion, but in a small 2-story house where there was a shop downstairs, and upstairs with a balcony overlooking the street was a small apartment. The family had at least 2 different stores. One was a silversmith and goldsmith store run by one of the family's sons, and the other was an all-purpose general store. And that general store was not something incredibly fancy, but really was just a place where you could go and buy food or some ribbons in order to make your dress fancier, just sort of everyday sorts of things. And that store ended up being really important for the research that I did because its records still exist today at New York Historical Society. And it really helped give me an eye into the everyday lives of the family. What were they eating every week? what kinds of things were they buying, and how did that compare to other people within the Jewish community and the people they were living among. Although Sarah and Isaac grew up in the Sephardic household and their father was Jewish, they could not have their birth records indicated at the synagogue. And that's because their mother was not considered halakhically, that is, legally Jewish. And I think this is something really important to keep in mind for early multiracial Jewish families, that their records may actually lie outside of the typical places we would go to find them. So instead of having the first record of Sarah and Isaac be at the synagogue, the first record appears at St. Michael's Church, the main church for the parish in which Barbados exists. And that church record was there because Sarah's mother, Sarah Esther, had taken her there to be baptized. And again, this may seem strange that somebody who ends up Jewish ends up being baptized, but it's actually not that atypical for this time period that people would make those sort of adjustments. And also, it actually is a really important moment for what Sarah's mother is doing in order to support her daughter's future. So if her daughter ever wanted to be able to be married on the island, since it was almost impossible to convert to Judaism, the only option was that she needed to first have been baptized at this particular church. And so by offering her daughter a baptism, she's really solidifying the possibility that her daughter will have rights that neither her mother, her grandmother, or her great-grandmother were able to achieve. So during this time period, being able to get married really is a way of protecting oneself, particularly for women of color. In addition, however, that record was the first time where Sarah's race was designated. So by submitting to the church, her mother is also submitting to the island's government system, which through church record keeping designated people's race. And so Sarah's race, from the moment she's born, is designated as being a person of color. And had she stayed on the island, that race would have stayed with her entire life and would not have been able to ever have any wiggle room to be changed. And so Sarah and Isaac might have grown up like many of the enslaved people who were living in and among Swan Street, some of whom, like Sarah and Isaac, had ties to the Nida Israel Synagogue, if it weren't for two incredibly rare things that happened in 1801. And the first of those happened because a member of their family died. And it was not a member of their father's family, but rather a member of their mother's family. Like the children, Sarah and Isaac's mother had a white father. And he, unlike their father, was a member of that Anglican church. And when he died, he had no legitimate children. And so he did something very unusual in terms of island politics. And that is, instead of leaving his entire estate to his white nieces and nephews, he left his houses to his children by women of color, his illegitimate or natural children. And so suddenly, in 1801, when Sarah's only 3 years old, her mother becomes the partial owner of a house along Hartley's Alley near Back Church Street. And this is really a monumental moment for the family because their mother goes from somebody who's considered a piece of property herself to somebody who owns property and has a house of her own to live in. It would turn out, however, that the location of that house was also incredibly important for lifting up the family. And that's because it was located near the old churchyard where very soon after they inherited the house would be built St. Mary's Church. And this was the primary church where wealthier people of color tended to attend services. So in ways that the grandfather couldn't have known, he's really setting up his children to be part of this elite inner circle of free people of color in Bridgetown. However, it was also located very near where would be established soon after he died, the Methodist Church. And this is where the methods I use for unpacking the children's family became really, really important. That I was really interested early on in not just tracing their father's genealogy, but making sure that I was tracing as far back as possible their mother's genealogy. And this turned out to be a gold mine because through their mother, they were related to a woman who today is known as Sarah Ann Gill, but during her lifetime was known as Anne Jordan Gill. And she is the first female national hero of Barbados. So it's like, whoa, through their mother, they are related to the most famous woman in early Barbadian history. And she was somebody who earned this reputation through her role in obtaining civil rights for free and enslaved people of color through religion, through this Methodist church. And that role in the family of using religion in order to obtain civil rights was something that was also important in Sarah and Isaac's family, as in their own lives as well. So just to give you a quick overview of what I covered so far, because their genealogy is a little complicated, here's Sarah, here's Isaac, here's those two sisters that passed away as children and never made it to being adults. Here's their mother, Sarah Esther Gill, who was in a relationship with Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, a Sephardic Jew. I was able, through their mother, one of her brothers was married to this woman, Anne Jordan, the most famous woman in early Barbadian history. And I was able to trace back their genealogy, not only to their grandmother, Jemima Lopez, but also back one more generation to a woman named Deborah Lopez. And Deborah, Jemima, Sarah Esther, all three of her brothers, and all of these 4 children were enslaved to the Lopez family before they eventually got freed. So really, very much the whole family was struggling in order to get their freedom. And the white grandfather that they inherited the house from also had a couple other families by different women of color who also inherited other houses around town. And one of those daughters ended up being a really important ally with Anne Jordan in the early Methodist Church. So that was the first big thing that happened for the family in 1801 that really set their destinies apart from most people's ability in terms of changing their life stories in early Barbados, and that was that they inherited property. The second one was, however, that their father took the siblings back to St. Michael's Church in 1801, and first he paid off the Lopez family to make sure that he could now free his children, and then he paid the church itself to allow him to manumit his children. And this was really important because it meant not only were they free, but all of Sarah's descendants, since slavery followed the maternal line, would also be free going forward. And it really is very, very unusual in terms of island politics during this time period. Most of the enslaved people in Barbados would need to wait 3.5 more decades until 1834 to 1838, when there was general emancipation on the island. So really, there are 2 of these instances that are very unusual, help give them this mobility that will impact the rest of their lives. So with those 2 events, the gaining of the house and the gaining of their freedom, Sarah and Isaac now became like a small cadre of free people of color who lived in and around these same streets where most of the Jews lived, often attending, the community often attended either St. Anne's, the Anglican Church, or the Methodist Church, or would sort of exist around the boundaries of the Nida Israel Synagogue. And finally, when Sarah was only about 12 years old, her brother decided enough was enough. Like his aunt, he had a religious awakening, but he didn't want to become a Methodist. Rather, he wanted to become a full member of the Nida Israel Synagogue and to join the Jewish community officially. But because that was not something that was possible for him to do in Barbados, he and his sister got on a boat and traveled south in order to convert. And they left the island and went south to another colony called Suriname. Now, today, Suriname may not seem like the most obvious place to go to convert to Judaism. So I feel like it's worth saying, like, why would you go to Suriname to convert? So part of this is just the difference between colonial Jewish geography versus Jewish geography today. Suriname, along with this little peanut-shaped island off the coast of Venezuela called Curacao, had the two largest Jewish communities in all of the Americas, much larger, many times the size of New York or Philadelphia, much better infrastructure. They had yeshivot. They actually had many moils there. They were really much more likely places that somebody would go within the Americas to convert. But you notice that Barbados is sort of equidistant from Egypt, from the peanut-shaped island, and from Suriname. So why choose Suriname? Well, Suriname was also unusual in that it had the largest community of multiracial Jews anywhere in the Americas. And by the time that the siblings arrived there, about half of the community had at least one African ancestor. So Suriname really is a much more likely place where they are going to find an inclusive Jewish community. And so they decide to go to Suriname. The reason for that history of why the community was so diverse lay in part not in the main port where the siblings would end up settling, but instead downriver in a town called Yoden Savannah, or Jew Savannah. And that was an early plantation town that had been set up as a sort of new Jerusalem. It was semi-autonomous. The Jews got to decide how they were laying things out. They put the synagogue at the, at the highest peak in the town. And in addition, they lay out the town like the way that the tribes are laid out around the tabernacle in the desert, and they try to follow Jewish laws about circumcision and conversion of enslaved peoples. So they start over the generations, starting in the 17th century, start circumcising and converting people, particularly if the enslaved people happen to have a Jewish father. And as a result, by the time that Sarah and Isaac arrive in Paramaribo, there's this community of people who have African and Jewish ancestry who've been halakhically Jewish, that is, Jewish according to Jewish law, for generations and generations. And in fact, by the time the siblings arrive, Suriname is such a bustling Jewish community that they actually have a couple of options where they could convert. And they decide to go to the Portuguese synagogue. And that makes sense for a number of reasons. One is their father's a Portuguese Jew, so it makes sense genetically that they're going to see that as their home community. But also, even if they didn't have that tie, it would be the place you would want to go to convert. Because during this time period for early American Jews, Portuguese or Sephardic Jews were seen as the classy Jews. So somebody, very famously, Mordecai Emanuel Noah, who has 3 of his 4 grandparents are Ashkenazi, but if anybody asks him what he is, he claims he's Sephardic, right? So if you have a chance to be Sephardic, you want to claim you're Sephardic. Some of you may have seen the interior of this synagogue because it's now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. But this is at this time it would have been inside the synagogue proper, and it's where Sarah and Isaac went before the governance board and asked for permission to convert. And Isaac received not only permission to convert, but also to be circumcised by one of the many moils. There are at least 7 moils living in Suriname during this time period. And following that procedure and his healing, the siblings would have gone to the small building behind the synagogue where more recently has been sort of where Kiddush ceremonies were held. But there's a little trap door right over in this portion of it. And there's a ritual bath beneath the stairs. It would have been filled with beautiful water, dried out today. But independently, they would have gone down one by one, immersed in the bath, said the prayers, and then come back out, now halakhically, legally considered part of the Jewish community. And this was considered a really completely acceptable place to have your conversions done. So sometimes I'll get asked, well, is a conversion from Suriname considered good during this time period? I'm like, interestingly enough, if you convert in New York or in Philadelphia during this time period, you get grief when you go to Europe, but Suriname, no. So Suriname's conversions are considered good conversions during this time period. So I mentioned there was also a second synagogue. And this is something that made Suriname a little bit unusual, that it had such a large community, that it had the earliest Ashkenazi synagogue in the Americas as well. But importantly, this Ashkenazi synagogue still used the Portuguese prayer book and was still considered sort of not as good as the Portuguese Jewish community, at least by the Portuguese Jews. In fact, if a Portuguese man married a woman from this community, he would get demoted to being a sort of second-class member of his own congregation and no longer be able to be called up to the Torah. But within both of these communities, people who had African ancestry and were considered Jews of color were also considered second-class members of the congregation. So here's where the difference between how race functioned in Suriname versus Barbados becomes really, really important. So as I mentioned, if Sarah and Isaac had stayed in Barbados, they would have always been people of color for their entire lives. And in fact, as an adult, even after Isaac becomes white in New York, when he goes back to Barbados, he's a gentleman of color. So he definitely still experiences this during his later adulthood. And so they have something similar to what we would later call the one drop rule in Barbados, where if you had any African ancestors, you were always a person of color. Not true in Suriname. In Suriname, if you were like Sarah and Isaac, somebody who was racially ambiguous and had 7 out of your 8 great-grandparents were European, you could either be considered white or a person of color. So if your parents were married, you would be considered white. If parents were unmarried, legally you were a person of color. And this is actually how we know that Sarah and Isaac's parents never married while they were in Suriname, because they appear on the census as people of color. But we also see in response to this that the community starts differentiating between those people who have African ancestry but are considered white and the people who are considered people of color according to the local racial laws. And completely contrary to Jewish law, they start augmenting their Jewish marriage contracts in order to be part of this local race-keeping system that's established by the government. And they do that by adding a clause into marriage contracts like this one by 2 people who had African ancestry, who were considered people of color, by adding a special clause that shows that their family had once been enslaved. And they do this in an interesting way. They add in that they were emancipated Jews, that is, Jews who had been freed. Instead of adding in like that they were Cushites, which is a term that was often used in early Jewish records in the Americas to talk about African peoples, they're still talking about them as Jews. They're not a separate race. They're just marking that they had this history of slavery. And once that was marked in your marriage contract, it meant that you were designated as second-class member of that community. Or if a European Jew married somebody with that designation, he also would become a second-class member of that community. So that meant you would have to sit in the bad seats in the synagogue, you would be married in the swampy part of the cemetery, you couldn't be called up to the Torah for honors, and you couldn't vote in any of the synagogue elections to change any of those kinds of penalties that people were receiving. So this can help us understand why it is that perhaps Sarah and Isaac, after they convert to Judaism, decide not to stay in Suriname, because had they stayed, since their parents weren't married, they always would have been considered this second-class kind of Jew. And it turns out that Sarah and Isaac were not alone in perhaps finding this to be an irritating policy that was going on in early Suriname. Before the siblings arrived, there's actually in the 18th century a third congregation or community of Jews called Darhei Yeshurim, Path of the Righteous. And it was located nearby in Siva Plain. And it was a community that was established by and for people who were considered Jews of color. And in this congregation, then they would be allowed to have full rights and not be penalized for their heritage. Unfortunately, however, this receives backlash from the European-led Jewish communities who are irritated that they're sort of circumventing some of the racial policies that are going on in the community. And when Dar HaYeshurun starts to try and hold full religious services, the Jewish communities try and shut them down. The members of Dar HaYeshurun petition to the local government, proclaiming that the treatment that they're receiving is actually illegal according to local laws, the kind of discrimination. And yet the local government sides with the European Jews. And by the time that the siblings arrive, Dar HaYeshurun has been disbanded, and all the Jews of color have been forced to rejoin the other synagogues. And that may help us understand why they didn't convert at this particular congregation. So because of these variety of laws and some of the things that are going on in Suriname, it's both more inclusive than many communities and yet still exclusive in particular ways. The siblings don't stay in Suriname, but instead decide to travel for Isaac back to Barbados, where he becomes involved in some of the civil rights protests and petitions involving Jews and their attempts to get the right to both participate in government and be elected to government positions. I'm not going to talk about that today, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk about in the question and answer, and it's something I talk about in detail in the book. Sarah, however, doesn't go back to Barbados, but rather, through the help of her father, travels on to London. And she does this because London not only has an enormous Sephardic community, so many times the size of what you would find in anywhere in the Americas, centered around the Portuguese congregation of Bevis Marks, but also because just south of the city was a very popular destination for young Jews from the Caribbean. And that was, if their parents had enough money, they would be sent, like Sarah was, to be part of these elite Sephardic boarding schools that would train them to be the leaders of the next generation in the Atlantic world. So these were places where the Montefiores and the Barrows and other really wealthy families would send their children home from the Caribbean to London in order to be trained how to become part of the Sephardic elite. So in this school, Sarah would have learned things like not only the languages that were considered important Jewish languages to the community, so Spanish and Portuguese and Hebrew, but also would have learned a little bit of French so that she could be classy, and she would have learned how to give charity as opposed to how to receive charity. So giving charity was a really important sign of being part of the wealthy establishment. And in addition, she would have learned how to manage a household filled with servants as opposed to being a servant herself. So in many ways, this retraining was just as important for her becoming part of the Jewish community as that original conversion was that she had back in Suriname. And it's here that Sarah has that beautiful little miniature ivory portrait made. So these miniatures are very small. They're only about 2 3/4 inches tall. And in spite of their smallness, they're incredibly expensive. They cost pretty much the same amount as if you got a full-sized oil painting made. But unlike those oil paintings, these are much more portable. So they become very popular amongst Jews during this time period as ways of sending on pictures of that might solidify a marriage or when you got engaged. But in addition, they become interesting to Jews in part because of the associations of eliteness and whiteness that are embedded in this particular kind of portrait genre. So unlike regular oil paintings where people's skin color was really tried to match through the oils to what it was in actual life, in the ivory miniatures, there's this attempt to use the kind of glow of the ivory itself in order to emphasize the whiteness of the participant who's having their portrait made. And this is done by creating these very thin sheets of ivory from pieces of tusk, and then they're ironed so that they get this kind of warm glow to them. And sometimes they'll even put a piece of silver behind them so that the light reflects it and goes, whoa, and kind of reflects backwards this lovely warm, delightful glow of kind of whiteness that happens with these particular portraits. In addition, however, it's very difficult to get the paint to stick to the portraits, and so portrait makers tended to emphasize very little painting around the face in order to get that skin tone that was seen as desirable. And we see some of this in Isaac's portrait, that his forehead, as well as under his eyes and around his face, is often unpainted in order to get that kind of magical glow that comes through in the ivory. One of the things that interested me was how different Sarah's portrait was from that of other multiracial women from this early Atlantic world. So here's a portrait of a multiracial woman from early Suriname and one from early New York. And here we see the portrait makers emphasizing their own biases or embedding their own biases into the way that they're creating the portraits. So portrait makers are told not to use a lot of paint on the face, particularly not to apply it in lines, because this would, for women, give a sense that they're marred. And we see that this has actually happened here, that instead of using a dot technique that they're told to use, they're using a kind of hatching technique of these lines that are normally reserved for background or for hair or for other things that you want to show as having texture. And this gives the women a sort of weird, scratchy appearance. And I want to emphasize here, that's not because the women actually had scratchy skin, right? This is the bias of the painter who's trying to use his paint to get across his idea that somehow their skin color is flawed, as opposed to the people whose skin color was being depicted as embracing that kind of ivory skin color. And we see this even in this portrait with a very light-skinned woman, where there's no good reason why they need to use this scratchy technique. Instead, it's really very much a choice of the paint maker and completely contrary to what they're told to do in painting manuals for the day. And we see very much a contrast with Sarah's portrait, where that kind of scratchy technique is reserved for the background and for her hair and for her dress, all the places it belongs, while her skin is left largely undecorated. So, as I mentioned, portraits were often designed as part of these exchanges that led up to marriages, because Jews often marry people from other ports because there weren't that many people in the small ports in the Americas. And indeed, around the time that her portrait is made, Sarah's portrait meets another portrait, which is of a slightly older gentleman, but not super old, named Joshua Moses. And he's in town on business from New York. And their portraits are a match, and they end up getting married at Bevis Marks. This is an important alliance for a number of reasons. One is that, like Sarah's family, Joshua came from an important merchant family. So his father, Isaac Moses, was the most wealthy and important merchant in early New York, just as Joshua's father had been the most important merchant in early Barbados. In addition, however, that Joshua is really benefiting from this marriage alliance in a lot of important ways. And the first one of those is that the woman that he's marrying is incredibly wealthy. So she comes not with just a small dowry, but with a 10,000 pound dowry, which is about $30 million worth of purchasing money during this time period. And by way of contrast, Joshua's mother had only brought to the marriage $1,000 dowry, so much, much less money. And that was considered just an astronomically large amount of money at the time. In addition, however, to bringing this large dowry, we see sort of a shift in terms of the dynamics about what's considered important about race during this time period. So had Joshua tried to marry Sarah at Bevis Marks about 15 years earlier, he probably wouldn't have been allowed to do so, not because Sarah wasn't good enough, but because Joshua wasn't good enough. And that's because, unlike Sarah, he is an Ashkenazi Jew. And so he would have been told to go get married at the Ashkenazi synagogue. But because of sort of changes in the upgrading of how Sephardic Jews are seen, really they're allowed to be married by this time period. So a very much a sort of important shift in terms of what identities are trumping which identities. After their marriage, Sarah and Joshua settle very close to Bevis Marks near the docks where Joshua is working. But before the first year of their marriage is out, Sarah becomes pregnant with their first child, and they decide not to stay in London, where most of them have only the most remote of relatives, but instead to travel back across the Atlantic and to settle not in early Barbados, but in early New York, along the lower end of Manhattan. And when they come here, they are very close then to Joshua's parents' house, as well as the early Shearith Israel synagogue. And here's where Joshua and Sarah establish their house. And within a couple of years after coming to early New York, Sarah's brother Isaac has had a big falling out with the synagogue. He's been demoted and is no longer allowed to vote in the congregation. And so he and their mother travel north, first to Philadelphia and then to New York, where he becomes business partners with his brother-in-law Joshua and eventually marries one of Joshua's sisters. So we really see a way in which those connections between Sarah and Isaac and their in-laws, who are part of this elite world of Shearith Israel, help them in terms of their racial reassignment to being white. So had they stayed in London, Sarah was no longer would have had the problems that she had in Suriname, where her race was being designated on her ketubah. In London, she's just marked down as being a convert. And when she comes to New York, she's still surrounded by members of the Barbados community who know about her African ancestry. In fact, her husband went to grade school with the grandchildren of her enslaver. But in spite of that, they help her become part of this white Jewish world that's in and among New York. And that's largely because the way race was understood in early New York varied from place to place. So it was inconsistent how race would be understood even between, say, New York and New Orleans, that race would be constituted differently. So in spite of early racism in early New York, that Sarah and Isaac are understood as being a white according to those local laws during the 1820s. So I mentioned that Sarah came to New York already pregnant with her first child. By the time that she's 30 and she passes away, she's had not one, but 10 children because she has 2 sets of twins. And of those children, 9 survived to adulthood. So most of her and Isaac's descendants come from her side of the family. And those family members, like her, would benefit from this inclusion that they got through their association with the Moses family. So her sons not only serve in the U.S. white military units during the Mexican-American and Civil War, but become Civil War heroes, help establish an early Jewish hospital in New York as a surgeon, become the president of the congregation, and also even marry into one of the premier Jewish families in early New York, that of Gershom Mendes Seixas, the most beloved early rabbi of Congregation Shearith Israel. So we really see them becoming insiders into this New York Jewish elite, not only in Sarah's own generation, but for the next generation as well. Most of the descendants come through Lionel with that marriage to the granddaughter of Gershom Mendes Seixas, though a couple of Sarah's other sons have illegitimate children who end up having lineages that go forward as well. One of the more interesting things about their story to me was the way in which that mobility that we saw happening in that earlier generation, because of some of the early circumstances of being freed, of being racially ambiguous, of having access to wealth, carry on into the next generation. So if you map out where Sarah's sons end up appearing. Several of them go off to China and become involved in the textile trade. Several end up going to San Francisco and trying to make it wealthy in the gold rush. Some fight in the Civil War and the Mexican-American War, and others end up along the Texas border. Well, a couple of them even try to overthrow the government in Nicaragua in a failed coup attempt. So we really see the family spreading around the globe, something which makes it difficult, I would say, in terms of genealogy for tracing like where the next generation goes to, as well as the dispersal of records throughout the Atlantic world, continuing on into that next generation. So I'm going to go ahead and pause there and see if anybody has any questions. I would love to answer anything that people have questions about.
Please put any questions in the chat box, and me and or Eric will answer. We'll pass them on to Laura. So far, nothing has popped up. If anyone does have further questions, just put them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. We'll let Laura continue.
Oh, okay. So I see
right.
one.
Oh, here we go.
Do you want me to answer the one from Evan?
No, go ahead. This is all you.
Yeah. So there's
sorry.
a question about somebody said, maybe I missed in the beginning, but how did I get interested in this family? That's a great question. So originally I had been interested in the story of Sarah and Isaac because I had been working on the debates about civil rights during the 1819 to 1831 that were sort of spread throughout the Americas. So I don't know how many people know about the bids for Jewish civil rights, but they really, Jews mainly in the Americas, unless they're enslaved, have the same rights as other people who are considered white during this time period, with a couple of major exceptions. And those exceptions, usually in early America, have to do, by the time of 1819 or so, to do with being able to vote and being able to hold public office. And we suddenly see around 1819 to 1831, the last places where Jews don't have full civil rights, them starting to have these different attempts to get the same civil rights as anybody else. And usually those are based on religious requirements. So if Jews would just convert to Christianity, which obviously they have reasons for not wanting to do, they could have had civil rights. But if they want to remain Jewish, they're often kept out of government. So I become interested in Isaac because he was part of this early bid to get Jews full rights in Barbados. And his story had ended very tragically, where in spite of all of his good efforts, the local Anglican government had said, yes, the Jews can have the right to vote, but only if you disbar Isaac and make him no longer a full member of the congregation and make him unable to vote. So Isaac ends up getting basically kicked out of the synagogue as a result. So that had really been my starting point for being really interested in this family. And it had taken me a much, much longer time to prove that the sister that I knew about from the portrait miniatures was the same sister Sarah that appeared in the early manumission records. Because anybody who works on Sephardic history will attest, Sephardic Jews often recycle names. And so just because somebody has the same name doesn't mean they're the same person. So it took me about 5 years to prove that sister was the same person early on as it was later. That was sort of the impetus of sort of getting obsessed. And I don't know about other people when they do genealogy, but certainly when I'm looking at history, is like you'll get caught up with like, I'm really sure this is the case. And if I could just find the evidence, and you think it's going to be easy to find, and then it turns out taking years and years and years. So very much this typical sort of genealogy detective story emerged out of that.
Right. Okay. So the next question is, how did Sarah and Isaac know about the Jews in Suriname?
Really good question. So during this time period, there's a sort of change in government. between the British and the Dutch, in part because of what's going on with Napoleon in Europe. And the British have taken over early Suriname. And as a result, just right around the same time period when Sarah and Isaac are there. So that does also help them in terms of getting to Suriname, that Suriname's now bilingual. They're using English in their records. So helpful as opposed to Dutch. But there's a lot of trade connections between the Jews in Suriname and the Jews in Barbados. So we actually have lovely record books of merchants who go back and forth all the time. The communities are quite close to each other.
What happened to Sarah's mother?
Good question. So Sarah's mother, I had mentioned that when Isaac gets kicked out of the synagogue and he decides to travel north to sort of find a better place to land, his mother comes along. And you can sort of see why, that her son has basically been discredited, and she's also looking for a place that will be more accommodating. So she, along with her Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, the father, donate a lot of money to the Philadelphia congregation, and that kind of smooths the way moving north. And she first comes to Philadelphia with him, and then when he comes to to New York on business, she joins him there, and she rents a house for a while in New York, very close to where Sarah and Joshua are living. And then during one of the different pandemics, she gets very ill. We're not really sure what she got sick with, but she dies quite suddenly, and she's buried in early New York in 1823. So she only makes it for a few years in New York, and she's buried, interestingly enough, in the Shereth Israel Cemetery, although there's no evidence to suggest that she ever officially converted.
Is your book available? I actually answered this in the chat. I put the link to your website for the Once We Were Slaves. But it can also be found on, I saw links for Amazon and whatnot if you just Google it. And but yeah, I put that in the chat. So we'll move on to the next one. Have you connected with any of living decedents?
Yeah, and just for the book available too, for people who like audiobooks, there's going to be an audiobook version coming out soon too. So keep your eye out for it if you like audiobooks. Yeah, I have connected with some of the living descendants. That was sort of one of the more interesting parts of the project that sort of evolved over time. That early on, I first met, just tracked down some of Isaac's descendants, and it was only pretty recently that I was able to connect with any of Sarah's descendants. They were much harder to find. So fortunately, one of Isaac's descendants, this is like a warning sign, he had sent a letter to the archive in Barbados asking for information, and the archivist did what all archivists do, which is they took his letter and they added it to the family file. So like, never send a letter to an archivist if you don't want it to end up in the archive itself, is my warning from that, because I've seen a lot of those kind of letters. But it allowed me to track him down and to meet up with him, and that was lovely, super helpful. And I do talk a little bit about that in the epilogue to the book, that I talk about some of the descendants and whatnot.
So someone comments, so Sarah was a quarter Black and her children were 1/8, or is she off or are they off by a generation?
Great question. So we know at least, she's at least 1/8 African-American, questionable. So we know that her father and her grandfather were on her father, and then her grandfather and her mother's side were both white. But in addition, we know that even her great grandmother on her mother's side was considered multiracial. So I'm not sure what percent that ends up being, but she has a lot of European ancestry.
For sure. Did Sarah die at an early age from illness?
Another really good question. So Sarah died in childbirth, which was really common during this time period, and not surprising given how many children she had. It's a miracle she lived as long as she did. But this is something I talk also about in the book, that 2 of her sister-in-laws died in childbirth almost right around the exact same time. So very common, and very common that the result of this is you'd have these large families of children being left to be raised by the father, but the fathers very rarely raised them. They were often raised by unmarried female relatives. So within Sarah and Isaac's family, most of the kids were actually raised by Joshua's sisters.
Could the mother also have passed as white?
We don't know. There are no portraits of her, and no textual evidence to suggest one way or the other.
Sure. Well, that's all the questions for now. If you want to continue on, and then I'm sure more will pop up as we finish up.
Yeah, so I guess that's sort of the end of my my big thing, though. I'm happy to talk to you about some of the things if people are interested in some of the resources that were unusual but particularly helpful for me in terms of tracing the family's line. I'd be happy to talk some about that. I don't know how many people have like ancestry from the Caribbean, but one of the things that ends up being particularly complicated is for the Caribbean genealogies, a lot of the records are fragmentary because of the history of hurricanes and fires and earthquakes in the Caribbean. And so you really have these very patchy records. But one of the things that I found particularly helpful is looking at the synagogue records in terms of where the marriages were and who was being kept track of in terms of the birth records. And I actually have, if you look on my, if I can pull up my website, but I actually have a list of different resources that people are welcome to use that have links to all the places where you can find them. Let's see if I can pull it up for you.
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, great. That has all the different places where you can find for different congregations, because right now it's very scattered in terms of every particular congregation has a different place that you'll find the records as opposed to them all being centrally located. But that said, I would say the most underused resource that I've seen is probably American Jewish Archives, where they have often copies of many of the records that are hard to, in order to have access to otherwise.
I don't really have anything to add other than just, oh, here we go, another question. What are current known descendants doing now? Occupation, etc. Are they affiliated with, or do they support the Jewish community?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So all of Isaac's descendants that I know of are not Jewish, because Isaac only has one child who survives to adulthood, and his son, as soon as Isaac dies, within the first year after his death, his son marries the girl next door, who's clearly been interested in for a while, and she's not Jewish. So his only son converts to being Episcopalian, and all of those descendants stay, as far as I know, stay Christian over time. And they tend to be quite wealthy. Their last name for a bunch of them is Poor, which is really deceptive because they're living along Fifth Avenue in Manhattan and have these incredible mansions, one of which was up for sale recently. And I was like, whoa.
So they're probably related to the Standards and Poor Index.
Maybe.
It's a joke. It's a bad joke.
Yeah. So his family ends up keeping a lot of the wealth in the family, but not sticking with being Jewish. And I would say one of the things that was sort of interesting with connecting with some of those descendants was there was some thought within that part of the line that maybe they had been rejected by the people in the family when after Isaac's son had died and after he had converted. And I was able to tell them through going through the wills and some of the other family documents that actually was not the case, that there had been a lot of back and forth between the two sides of the family. And in fact, a lot of really, really sweet mementos left between the two parts of the family, indicating that they wanted to maintain ties. So I think it's a good example of where sometimes there's stories that the families kind of come to but aren't actually borne up by the historical evidence. So that's sort of Isaac's side of the family. Sarah's side of the family, I don't know tons of their occupations, though I do know that one of the descendants on Isaac's side, the one who I had mentioned, where um, where I had tracked him down because he had written a letter to the Historical Society, and they had put it in their archives. It was very interesting that he was somebody where, when I asked to meet up with him, he said, "Oh, let's meet at St. Nicholas Society," which is this kind of fancy historical society for people who have early elite ancestors from New York. And we were meeting in a building in Manhattan that was like where Daughters of the American Revolution were. And I thought, oh, this seems like bad news, that he's going to be like not happy that his ancestors were enslaved and whatnot. But he was super excited because his son was a civil rights lawyer, and Isaac had been involved in these civil rights disputes and fights. And he really felt that there was this genealogy going forward in connection to the past. So at least some of them are involved in civil rights work today, which was really, really interesting to see, in spite of not being Jewish, that they were still like really interested in these same sort of questions that their earlier ancestors had been interested in. So
Evan comments, as an interesting exercise, people who have done DNA testing can take a look at matches from Barbados and Suriname. One can filter results by country on MyHeritage, and he has found some mysterious matches there. Evan, that might be through our Dutch ancestry.
So I also have I have early ancestors from Barbados. A lot of my father's family is from Barbados. So yes, I would say, and I often will run into people who are distantly related if I'm doing research there. But I do think, yes, the DNA testing is sort of an interesting way of going about finding people who you might not otherwise have known about. Definitely some of the descendants, the people I had talked to were mainly through Isaac, had also, they had come up with African ancestry, and it was actually quite helpful for trying to figure out like where their African ancestors, what parts of Africa they were from. So that was really helpful for my research. In addition, just sort of, I've sort of lost what I was going to say about that, but yeah. So in any case, I do think that. Oh, I know what else it was. When I had sort of connected with some of the people who thought they were descended through the illegitimate lines. Remember, I had mentioned that some of Sarah's sons had children out of wedlock, and some people thought maybe they were descended through that. DNA has been really helpful with being able to match up, say like, okay, you need to talk to this cousin, this potential cousin, and see if your DNA lines match, because that will be able to answer these questions where they had family stories that they were related but weren't particularly sure. So I do think DNA can be really helpful in a lot of ways of solving some of those questions that are kind of lurking out there otherwise.
Agreed. I have some of those myself, just not in Holland. Holland's been very easy for me. Does anyone else have any questions, comments? Anything? Alrighty, then. And Laura, you said you had nothing more to. Okay.
I think that's it, my friends.
Okay, just making sure. I don't want to cut you off accidentally.
Nope, no, it's okay.
So I want to thank everyone for coming this afternoon. Oh, okay, it's just thanking us. Sorry, I'm on the wrong window. I pre-planned and then thank you everyone for coming. I put the links to our website and our donation site in the chat, but I can put them in again. And if you have any questions about the JGS of Pittsburgh, feel free to reach out. And I also put her website, her main website, and her book website in the chat. So before we close out, before we close out for the day, if you want to look for that, that'd be great. And here's our websites again. And don't forget about our next programs on March 27th and April 24th. And I think Laura was just going to say one more thing.
No, I was going to say, if you go to my website, there's links to not only discussion questions for book groups, but also color versions of all the images, and as well to larger versions of the family trees, so which you're welcome to print out too. So
Cool.
if those are helpful to
Awesome.
people.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Thanks.